Welcome to the Ralston College podcast. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Those of you who are listeners to this podcast will know that one of its recurrent themes is the realization of human potential and the conditions that make that realization possible. We've been especially interested to look at what kind of educational contexts are necessary across the wide range of human diversity to realize the potential of human individuals. In an age like ours that is characterized by homogeneity in education, you might say by bureaucratic one-size-fits-all thinking, it can be difficult to imagine how different things could be. One of the best ways to approach this conundrum is to look both in the present and back through history at remarkable people and at the experiences and institutions that shaped them into the people they became. My colleague Bernadette Guthrie and I have actually written a paper that looks at 6 case studies: Alexander the Great, Hildegard of Bingen, Peter Paul Rubens, John Henry Newman, Jane Austen, and Frederick Douglass, each of them representing a different context, from the guild to the monastery to the university to the home to the book, precisely to show how much wider a range of possibilities there has been in the past than many of us face today, with respect, you might say, to the pathways for the realization of individual potential. It is in that spirit that today's podcast and the one that follows it do the same thing for a great person of our own time, Ian McGilchrist. I've had the privilege of spending quite a bit of time with Dr. McGilchrist in the last few years, especially while he was with us at Ralston College this past spring for several weeks to give the Sophia lectures, which, incidentally, we're going to be releasing in the next couple of weeks. Dr. McGilchrist is a person of astonishing learning and independence of mind, and so I was curious simply to ask him, how did Ian McGilchrist become Ian McGilchrist? What were the educational influences and institutions that played a role in making this great man what he came to be? This conversation is the first of a 2-part interview in which Ian shares his remarkable trajectory, beginning as a boy before he went to Winchester College, all the way through his time at Winchester, and then Oxford as an undergraduate, and then All Souls College as a fellow, and then into medical school and beyond. But what is most remarkable about this conversation is that it turns out that it was not New College, Oxford, not All Souls, Oxford, that holy of holies of academia, not his time at medical school, not his research fellowship at Johns Hopkins. As formative of all of these were for Dr. McGilchrist, it was none of these that he singled out as the most defining educational experience of his life, but rather a boys' school, the British public school founded in 1382 by William of Wykeham. It is the 6 years that he spent there that Dr. McGilchrist credits with instilling within him the curiosity, freedom of thought, and appreciation of beauty that has inspired and sustained his intellectual work for the entirety of his life as a scholar. As Ian shares with us today, Winchester was marked above all by 2 qualities: an expectation of excellence and a freedom for both the students and the teachers to pursue their interests wherever they led. It was in those teenage years of free exploration that Dr. McGilchrist would first discover within himself the questions that would animate the remainder of his life. I hope you will find this conversation, the first of a 2-part interview, as illuminating and as exciting as I did. I hope, too, that you will join us at Ralston College in expanding the range of pathways on which the realization of human potential so vitally depends. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Thanks for listening. Well, good. I have the enormous pleasure this afternoon of sitting here in my office at Ralston College with Dr. Iain McGilchrist, who is well known to many of you, the philosopher, theologian, neuroscientist, psychiatrist. I think I've got all of that right. And the author of some beautiful and important books, including The Master and His Emissary and the matter with things. And yet, here we are, and we're not going to be talking directly about those books, which I know many of you are reading or have read and admired and have been productive in your thinking. Instead, today, Ian and I are going to talk about his own educational trajectory. And I'm interested in that for a couple of reasons. And the first is that it is because it is a trajectory that would be very rare or perhaps in some sense impossible today, because the kinds of institutions that you will hear about him when he speaks about them today, whether they exist at all anymore is really an open question. They certainly don't exist in that sense as they did. But also because that very trajectory, for me, and Ian and I have talked about this several times over some years, has for me been very inspiring for the way it reveals what educational institutions can do and be, and what is possible for someone of 10 or 11 or 12 or 15 or 16, or how an institution can be especially productive of extraordinary talents by being the least instrumental about it. For example, all of these are things that we may touch on, and it's my highest hope that in hearing about the very remarkable journey, educational journey of this very remarkable man that I have the pleasure of having not only in my office but to call a friend, that may inspire the trajectories and journeys of those who are listening, and perhaps of the ways in which those who are listening may have some bearing on the education of others, whether they're children, their friends, their students, and so on. So, Dr. McGilchrist, thank you so very much for being up for this chat.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Stephen. It's lovely to be here in Savannah. It's my first visit here. I'm loving every moment of it, and it's great to be sitting down with you and talking about these things.
Well, we can start wherever you would like to start, Ian, but could you give us maybe just a little bit of a sketch of where you came from in terms of your family, the deeper background? You said something to me about both of your grandfathers recently being the seventh of seven children. We can start wherever you like, but give our listeners a sense of where Ian McGilchrist came from, even before you went to school, and then we'll move to your schooling.
Yes. Well, as you mentioned, my two grandfathers were each the seventh of seven, and each of them lost their father before they were 11. And in those days, there was not much provision, if any, for orphans, for single mothers, for anybody who had what nowadays would be considered some kind of a disadvantage. And so it very much fell to them to see that they had to make their own way, really, in life. And they did. One became a research chemist, and the other became a doctor. And my own father was a doctor, an interesting man. He was, I suppose nowadays one might say he was a bit on the spectrum. He was a very kind man, a very gentleman. He had a good sense of humor, but he didn't really understand the sort of things that I guess would have fascinated me. He thought there was something rather funny about mental illness and psychiatry and things like that, and also about spirituality, both of which are kind of important to me, and they certainly weren't part of my upbringing. I guess nobody in my family had ever been to what in England is called a public school, which, we like to be paradoxical, means a private school. And my parents certainly wouldn't have been up for paying for me to go to a public school because it's expensive. But my dad moved because of his work, and for reasons to do with where he moved, I changed the school systems. I went from if you like, it was a government-funded, it's called direct grant system of grammar schools in this country, which are non-fee pay. From that to a private school. And that necessitated quite a bit of a change. At the age of 10 and a half, I think it was, or 11, I made the transition, and in the new school I went, people had been studying Latin and Greek for 3 years by the age of 11. And they'd also been doing much more advanced mathematics than I was doing. I was told to expect to have some knowledge of trigonometry and calculus, and we hadn't got to that at all in the school I was in. So my parents arranged for me to have some tuition on these subjects, and I went from knowing really nothing to being, at a presentable level to go into this new school system in the space of, 4 months or something like that. And fortunately, I love learning. And I've never been able to understand people who don't love learning. I don't mind what it is. I'm fascinated by knowing new things. Anyway, there we are. And so I ended up in this system. And the people who were teaching me said, well, this boy should go to Winchester College, which in those days was the most academically selective school in the country. Rather gratifyingly to the headmaster, somebody arrived, I think, from Saudi Arabia with his son at Heathrow Airport and told the taxi driver, take me to the best school in England, as he wanted to have his son admitted. And the taxi driver went straight to Winchester. So I don't know that history relates whether the son was accepted. Most probably not, but there we are. Anyway, because to get into Winchester, you had to have a very high level of achievement at a very young age. So I was destined to sit it was called election exam at Winchester, which is basically would allow you to become one of the core of the foundation, the 70 so-called poor scholars, i.e. their education was funded by the college. And it was founded by William of Wykeham, who was the second most powerful person in Britain after the king in the 14th century. And he came from a humble background himself, which is, I think, worth pausing on for a moment, because there is a sort of completely askew idea that from a humble background you would never have got anywhere in Britain until now. Actually, it's probably more true that you would have got somewhere then, because now we are doing everything to put barriers in the way of high achievement from people from so-called poor or disadvantaged backgrounds. And this wasn't in the case of my grandparents. They just simply got on with it and worked hard and did well. So Cardinal Wolsey, for example, was the son of a butcher. Cardinal Wolsey, who was an incredibly powerful man in Britain, when Britain was a very powerful country. Anyway, to come back to William of Wykeham, he had the idea of this foundation of 74 scholars who would be trained up to become probably the future bishops and archbishops of the church. And the natural progression was that you went from Winchester to his foundation at Oxford, New College, Oxford. Interestingly, again, the name is a little askew. I know that one boy I met when I went to New College eventually had come from somewhere in the north of England and was not keen on the idea of going to this very stuffy, old-fashioned Oxford. But he saw that there was a college called New College. So he just founded 1384. So he directed his efforts at going to New College. Anyway, what am I saying here is that I definitely don't come from the sort of background of people who are naturally privately educated. And it slightly galls me that, I have to apologize, or I certainly don't actually apologize, for having been to a thoroughly wonderful school, which was really one of the best times of my life, and had very high standards. And there really were no limits to those standards. You were encouraged to excel and then to excel more. And there was really no limit to what they would say, if you feel like doing that, do that. So the college... Winchester College election examination in those days was an extraordinary affair. There was a Latin paper, a Greek paper, an English paper, a French paper, a maths paper, and a science paper. And these were 3 hours, so we went on for 3 days. And they really expected quite a high standard. So we were given chunks of Latin verse and Latin prose to comment on the versification, to translate, and so forth. And the questions we were asked were deliberately difficult and provocative, to try and weed out those who'd simply been stuffed with information from those who could think for themselves. So one question I remember in the Latin paper was, translate into Latin, soapy suds wash brightest. Always use soapy suds. You know, it makes you stop in your tracks. You've been trained on Caesar and Cicero and whatnot. I mean, there you have to try and think for yourself about it. So that's what was involved in that. The French paper, I remember, involved a rather severe-looking old man telling a story in French to us without any words of English. And then our job was to go back and write down the story as we remembered it. That was at least part of it. The English paper, I was asked to comment on George Herbert's poem, The Collar. I struck the board and cried no more. A wonderful poem, but quite a difficult poem for a 12-year-old to begin to understand. And it was great fun. Afterwards, there was an interview involved in which you were interviewed by the head of maths, the head of French, the housemaster of college, where the 70 scholars lived in the old medieval buildings, who became my housemaster, and the headmaster, who was Sir Desmond Lee, who's a classical scholar, translated Plato. And I just remember rather enjoying it, except for being asked by the French master. He said, "Décrivez-moi," describe me. And this was not a flattering portrait, because he was an old, thin, grey-haired, pale-looking man. And I remember saying, "Monsieur, vous avez un peu assez jaune. You have a somewhat yellow complexion." I don't know if this is going to go down well. But anyway, the long and short of that was that I got there. And in Britain, there is a system which still, I think, I don't know if it quite still exists in the same form, but there were O levels, ordinary levels, and A levels, advanced level exams. And the normal thing for somebody who was going to go on to university would have been to have done some O levels. I think the minimum would have been 6, though you could do as many as you liked. And you'd probably do 3 or 4 A levels subjects, which were more specialized, and obviously a higher standard was expected. And in most schools, you would do the O levels at the age of 16 and then specialize towards your university subjects. And at Winchester, the term I arrived, we did the O levels age 12 and got them out of the way because they were considered extremely boring and simply had to be done in order that you jumped a hurdle, otherwise you wouldn't be able to go to university. So what that meant was that we were then free to stop worrying about the curriculum and really have what I consider a real education, which is where masters, we call them dons, but whatever you like to call them, teachers, who were intelligent, imaginative, one hoped, were able to lead their charges towards the things that interested them. And this is the most important thing about my education, was the sense of excitement in the classroom, that somebody was talking about something that they cared about and they were able to convey something. It was like a spark of fire that crossed from the teacher to me or to my fellows. And that kindled something in us which made us want to know more. So there was no need to coerce people to learn. They wanted to. And I think partly you may say, well, that because it's a highly selective school, that's understandable. But I think also it was to do with this idea of freedom, that there was freedom for the boys and freedom for the masters. Nowadays, in our educational system, there would be a much more closely dictated curriculum, and the teachers would have much less of a say in what and how they taught. And they would be inspected and so on, and they would be made to fill in forms and tick boxes and so forth. None of that existed. And I suppose I was lucky that at the school I was, it was very benign. in the period I was there, it was a very liberal place to be. One hears stories of, private schools, so-called public schools, where children were treated very badly and even abused and so on. I was fortunate that this didn't appear to be the case when I was there. And I had a very fine housemaster who was really a model to me of what a father should be. He was kind. He was, however, he had clear boundaries. He was very funny and was capable of being able to put almost anything into a perspective that made it seem amusing and endearing rather than threatening. Which wasn't to say that he belittled one's anxieties. He was willing to listen to them, but he had a wonderful way of steering one's perspective to another way. And it was almost impossible to be with him without laughing, which was very fine, really. And he picked up that I was very interested in a whole lot of things, including religion. I mean, it had never been part of my family life. They'd never taken me to church once. And I got to Winchester and started to hear wonderful music. There was this medieval chapel and a choir that sang, I'm sure they sang a lot of things, but what I remember was the Renaissance polyphony. And I became a member of the chapel choir and remained one throughout my time at school. And the college tutor, who was sort of second in command to the housemaster, had a great interest in this kind of music and ran a madrigal club once a week, which we went to. And so I had a wonderful sense of freedom, of exploration. We had classes on Italian art, and later at age 17, I left and went off to spend time in Italy and went to all these places that I'd read about and all the galleries and saw the works of the sculptors and the painters that had only been presented to me, I think, largely in black and white slides. But it was wonderful to go and see them in the full colour. So that was part of it. And another part of it was that the dons, the teachers, lived with their families in houses on a couple of 18th century, 17th in one case, at 18th century streets, very close to the college, within a minute or 2 minutes walk. So that you could just walk out of the college along the pavement, and then there would be these houses. And there was a sort of culture of encouraging boys to call in and talk and discuss things whenever they felt they needed to. And I'm afraid I remember now with some embarrassment doing this on a number of occasions and being welcomed in. But I and my colleagues had no idea at that stage of what it must have been like for them, with marriages and children of their own and work to prepare and all the things that come with running a house and all of that, although they had help with that because they rented their houses from the college. But they set aside their time and were always welcoming and used to sit us down and play music to us. I mean, on a gramophone, and talk to us about things that mattered to us. I remember going and I had a discussion with one of the other boys about a problem in theology called the scandal of particularity, which refers to the fact that necessarily if Christ was to be born as an incarnation of God, it had to be in some place and at some time. And that seemed a little unequal for everyone else. It was all very well if you happened to be around in the year dot in Galilee, but if you lived in Huddersfield or something in the 20th century, no. So we couldn't reconcile ourselves to this. So I remember knocking on the door and saying, "Can you help us with the scandal of particularity?" to one of the chaplains, and bless him, he did invite us in and said all the things that one would say and needed to say about that. But I'm really just conveying the idea of what a kind of place it was. And increasingly, as one passed through the years, I suppose I was there from 12 till, it was 5 to 6 years.
5 to 6 years.
Yes. And when I left, I'd already got my scholarship at Oxford, and without which, again, I probably wouldn't have gone to Oxford. And that meant, again, a lot of freedom. So I did what I wanted in that last period. But anyway, the point is that throughout that period of years, your timetable became more and more under your control. So to begin with, it was relatively mapped out. But as you grew and grew up, you were made to take responsibility for your own study, which wasn't such that you would have to, keep it entirely to yourself. The idea was that you studied things that were likely to be the subjects that were going on in the class and bring your own contributions to them and read around them. And that worked very, very well. There were streams or ladders, as they were called, for the different specializations of the way in which you might want to go. So science was obviously one. The humanities, broadly speaking, history, French and English was another. And when I say French, I mean also modern languages, although the main ones were French, German and Russian. And the A ladder, which was classics. And I started off thinking I wanted to be on the science ladder because I came from this scientifically orientated family. And I was quickly very disappointed because I'd loved what my grandfather had talked to me about and so on. And I got there and found that the stuff we were doing in class was stultifyingly boring. It meant sort of grinding away at the resoundingly obvious to demonstrate something that you knew in advance what it was going to be, but you had to go through the motions and then write up a report in a kind of denatured English in which you did nothing, but a thing was placed. A beaker was placed in the fume cupboard and all the rest. And I thought this is stilted and stultifying. And of course, it could have been presented differently. And I think it's fair to say I am criticizing the way in which it was taught. But I gather from talking to a lot of other people that at school, for example, physics was a kind of dull subject. Later in life, I discovered that physics was essential in a way to philosophy, and that it was a branch of philosophy, as of course it would have been always seen. After all, the root is physis, nature in Greek. So learning about the nature of things, well, that's pretty important. But that was not the way it went. I remember measuring pieces of ticker tape left by trolleys accelerating at a certain speed and this sort of thing. Whereas if we'd been talked to about quantum field theory and black holes and things, I might have thought, wow, this is something I need to know more about. So I then moved to the humanities, which became probably the core thing that I did, the English languages and history. And then after I got my scholarship to Oxford, I was entirely free to do what I wanted. I went back to classics, Latin and Greek again, which I'd been studying up until the age of 13. But that's more or less how it worked, except that for one feature, there was something called div, which just division, but what it meant was that you were in a division, a class, and in that class, it didn't matter what you specialized in, you had to do a certain number of slots in the week, I think 4 or 6, which were general humanities education. So even if you were not interested in that, you were training to be a scientist, you had to do that core, which I think is enormously important because much as I value science, and I believe that one of the problems now is that science is undervalued, not overvalued. It's wrongly presented, and it makes claims that are not supportable, or at least good scientists don't, but in the popular imagination it is thought to do. And in fact, in this process, it loses some of its important appeal. So science is very important, but until the 1970s or 80s, probably rather few people would have left school without some grounding in the humanities, having read some Shakespeare, knowing something about probably English history, and so forth. And probably rather little philosophy, but it would be good if you're going to be a scientist, and particularly if, as I ended up becoming a doctor, and I argued actually that people who are heading for a medical career should compulsorily have at least a year of something at the beginning before they start, which is philosophically based. What is a human being? What is a body? What does healing mean? What is death? Unfortunately, there is a sort of default decision that we are machines, and death is when the machine is switched off and must be avoided at all costs. and that the only meaning of life is to carry on, well, we really don't know what, because our values are all utilitarian now. So inculcating a sense of greater values of honor, of goodness, of beauty, of truth, of admirable things was something that was part of my education, but I think would be less so now. So that's really where it was. And I remember when I left school, one of the masters saying to me, you will never work to the standard that you've been working to here again. And I thought, well, I don't know about that. But really, I think he was almost right. That I found university was a little bit of an anticlimax because it was more pedestrian somehow. And I'd love to think that this carried on, even at Winchester. I don't know if it does in exactly that way. It has changed. I think it's decided that, I think it's given up belief in what is unfairly branded as elitism, which is just doing things very well and getting satisfaction from learning a skill. So,
well, if I may, I'd like to ask a few. I know we have other moments and stages in your education that we're going to talk about, but I want to linger with Winchester for another few minutes and ask you a couple of questions about your experience there to paint an even clearer and sharper picture, or even more evocative picture of what Winchester was like in those days. And you mentioned that perhaps the sciences were not taught as they might have been, and perhaps that was typical at that time and so on. I'd love to know if you have any recollections or stories of teachers, because also, as you say, the curriculum was less and less sort of circumscribed or prescribed the more advanced you became in your studies, and that a big ingredient in all of this appeared to be having teachers that would inspire the boys to learning. And I'm wondering if you have any recollections of moments that happened where the spark was lit for you in the classroom, or a trajectory of learning or discovery or research that you went on because you got excited about it, and how that happened.
Yes, I certainly do. But I think your phrase "in the classroom" immediately made me think that actually a lot of what I learned was not necessarily directly through the classroom. So a lot of it actually was in conversations with other boys and with older boys. So the way in which we lived communally in very much a medieval monastic way.
But describe that for us. What?
Well, the school was, the original foundation was this medieval foundation of 70 scholars, and that carries on to now. But since the 18th century, there began to become so-called commoner students whose parents were prepared to pay for them to sit and have the same education, which was recognized to be excellent, that these scholars who were headed for the high offices in the church were having. And so there are 10 now. There were probably only one originally, but there are now 10 commoner houses of about 40 boys each, I believe. Well, certainly that was what it was in my time. And still the 70 scholars, of which I was one. And those 70 scholars lived in 5 or 6 rooms, I forget quite how many now. So there'd be, on average, about 10 or 12 in each room. And they would be equally boys from the first year up. In every year, there would be a slice of that particular cake. So where you were living, and you were very much living in the open in this big room, each of us had a little desk and a place that was divided by a wooden partition where you could sit and study. But nonetheless, there was this common area in which most of us spent our time sitting, talking, and doing the kind of things boys do, like trying to push one another, have a scrum in front of the fire. I mean, health and safety would have a nightmare now, because of course we had open fires in the rooms from morning till night. Anyway, so one learned a lot from older boys who were interested in conversations and listening to them. One learned a lot from, as I've suggested, from the dons, the masters outside of school hours. And I particularly learned a lot from my housemaster, because in a way, and I don't think it's just, I think it's a thing about learning and education in general, is that you model yourself on somebody. You see somebody that you think, this is interesting, this is good, this is something like, I'd like to be more like this. And so you feel your way into what it's like to be that person and take on some of their thinking. So my housemaster, Martin Scott, had a great influence on me. He was probably the most influential person in my life, in my education. And fortunately, an entirely benign one. And he would say, Ian, I'm going to take Sheba, his black Labrador, for a walk. Do you want to come? And I'd go, and we'd walk over the downs declaiming George Herbert and Donne and John Clare, a favourite of both his and mine. And so this was all part of education. But I think there are certainly things that stick in my mind. I mean, one was a wonderful term when a rather severe Heathcliff-like master, who was a medieval historian, decided to devote the term to the Italian Renaissance scholars. And so we had texts from Guido d'Arezzo and these various people, their writings in Italian or Latin and in English. And so we worked with that. And I found that wonderful to find, the very words speaking to me of these people who invented this, but were part of the genesis of this wonderful culture, civilization that I was so enticed by. This wasn't a moment that set me on fire, but there was a canon at the cathedral and the college were contiguous, who was, his name was Emmanuel Armand de Mendieta, and he was a Belgian Catholic who'd come from Catholicism to Anglicanism and had become a canon of the cathedral. And he was known to be an expert on an aspect of Augustine. And we happened to be studying Augustine's Confessions in one of the classes. And so he was invited to come in and talk about that. And the first thing he said was, today I'm going to talk about the anti-astrological polemic of St. Basil of Caesarea. Also, I'm going to speak in French. So that was a class. But to redress this idea, because it absolutely wasn't one of terrific sort of solemnity. It was kind of deep, scholarly excitement mixed with humor. And one term, what had we been studying? This was with Martin Scott. The other thing was something else. But we've been studying an aspect of medieval European history. And we got to the end of it, and the exams were over. It was the end of the year, and he said, okay, we've got 2 more weeks. We don't need to prepare. Let's have some fun. Would you like to talk about early Christian heresies or late Victorian murders? And there was an even show of hands. And we communally agreed we'd like a week on early Christian heresies and a week on late Victorian murders, on which Martin had a rich fund of stories. So what I want to convey is the sense of enjoyment, the sense of unpredictability, but the sense of always going somewhere exciting and a lot being expected. So, for example, in one class, I think we were doing Pope and Dryden, and so we were asked to write an essay on the advantages and disadvantages, the values and drawbacks of heroic couplets, which were commonly written by people like Pope. And for fun, I decided to write my essay in heroic couplets. I didn't think anything much of it, except that I wanted to pull his leg slightly, because I wanted to say, well, heroic couplets do have their drawbacks, but by showing him that actually heroic couplets can tell a story quite well. And he had come from Bradford Grammar to Winchester. Bradford Grammar is a very good grammar school, but it's outside of the public school system, outside of the private system, in other words. And he was interviewed by Edmund Blunden, actually, and it was published in the Times Higher Educational, or the Times Educational Supplement. And I remember that my teacher for that, Ken Groves, told him this as a story of something he could not have imagined happening, and yet it was the kind of thing that daily did happen.
It's such a wonderful story, and it is the extent to which this extraordinary period in your life was in some deep way unscripted.
Absolutely.
Of course, there were very high standards and there were classes and teachers, and yet the way all of that unfolded would be unrecognizable to any school I've ever heard of in certainly North America or anywhere I've been. I've never seen a school that had that kind of latitude and freedom, but I also don't think I've seen a school that was capable of producing the kinds of persons I know that Winchester has produced. And you've told me a beautiful story once about, I should say, the listeners to this podcast may be familiar with the conversation I had the great pleasure to have with the late Freeman Dyson, physicist, who, of course, is also a Wickhamist.
Yeah.
And Freeman Dyson had a beautiful story about arriving at Winchester, and at some point you just described the chapel and the choir that you sang in there. The chapels may sound small, but the Winchester Chapel is a formidable medieval building. It's a big, North American listeners might think of it as a cathedral more than a chapel, in the sense that it was not a small building. Let's say
a small cathedral, yes.
A small cathedral. There we are. And Freeman Dyson did a story about climbing the roof of this medieval structure.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think I was once.
I think you're thinking, are you of me?
No, and I know I'm not thinking of you, but I think that I once was talking to you about your time at Winchester, and I said, Freeman Dyson has this wild story about climbing the roof of the medieval chapel at night or something.
Yes.
And you said, I did that too. and I thought, what? Because when I was talking to Dyson about this was an example for him about the kind of liberty that was it was not really allowed. In fact, it wasn't allowed, but at the same time, the response was, well, that was quite an undertaking, and now you might be in a bit of trouble for it, but nonetheless. Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, Ian, you have a beautiful story about your own climbing of that and of the what might have been considered a punishment or a response. So will you tell us that story?
Yes. We were playing a game with a football in this quadrangle, which is where the scholars live. And the chapel forms one rather grand side of it. And somebody had booted the ball so high that it went over the parapet and landed on the roof of the chapel. And there is a tower to go up there, but it was locked. So we thought, what are we going to do? We lost the ball. I said, it's okay, I'm going up there. So I climbed up this vertical thing. There's a fire escape, but you just, go up there and rescue the ball. And to my shame, I found that although it was easy going up, it looked very perilous going down. I can't go down. And I was stuck. So somebody very kindly went and spilt the beans and said, Ian's stuck on the chapel roof. Can we have a key? And a key was found. And afterwards, Martin Scott pretended to chastise me for this and said, this is not something that really we encourage boys to do. So he said, I'm afraid I'm going to have to set you a task. A task was some kind of a punishment. And it is to compare, I think it was, Donne's Holy Sonnet at the Round Earth's Imagined Corners with Gerard Manley Hopkins' sonnet, Carrion Comfort. And at the beginning, I looked at these things and scratched my head and thought, they've got nothing in common. What am I going to say? Anyway, I stayed up till about 3 o'clock in the morning. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I had convinced myself that they had a great deal in common to say. And afterwards, my housemaster was invited to dinner by my parents. And he said, do either of you have an interest in stegophily? And my mother said, stegophily? No, I don't think so. And then he told this story. So, yes, it was a happy time, a very happy time for me. I didn't feel my parents had somehow abandoned me. And actually, they lived in Winchester. And so we were not encouraged to go home too often, but probably every other weekend I would go home. And it was very nice. I felt, in touch with it. And I made friends there that have lasted my life and who are, I can say, amongst the most decent and lovable people that I have known. I left Winchester thinking that most people were highly intelligent, flexible in their thinking, funny, kind, tolerant, generous, and I got a bit of a shock. But really, it produced some very, very decent people who have gone on being very good friends.
It's such a stirring account, and I just love this story about what I think all of us know of occasions when punishment is meted out, and it's not a corrective. It does damage rather than something salutary. And this is such an inspiring and beautiful story for me because that which was portrayed as a corrective, as a kind of reaction to or corrective against something that had been out of bounds, broken the rules, so to speak, was used by your teacher as an occasion actually to awaken an even greater love of high things. Was that which was presented as a reprimand was in fact an invitation to realize your spirit that had been the very spirit of the man who'd climbed the cathedral to climb in another sense. I just there's so much about what pedagogy is at its best. That's in that anecdote, and I just want to make clear to our listeners that among the many extraordinary aspects of this, just in case anyone has not followed some of these basic facts, Ian McGilchrist took the exams to come in to Winchester College in Winchester, England, at the age of 12, and they were formidable exams.
Scholarship.
The scholarship exams. He was awarded, it became one of but a dozen scholars that year who were given scholarships to study this from the foundation, these dedicated for the poor boys from that 14th century language. But within less than a year of that, you had already taken essentially what would have been the exit exams of a 16 or 17-year-old, the O-levels, in Latin and Greek and French and I think you said some math, so higher math.
That's it in English, yeah.
Maths and English. At the age of 12, to be clear, and these were formidable exams. And then you had several years of a kind of intellectual liberty in the context of this place of extraordinary inspiration and excitement. And this to me is something very much lost in our present world, where in North America we talk about grades. There's not a great deal of communion between seventh grade and ninth grade, between 13 and 15 or 12 and 14-year-old. And that a vast amount of what was most important to you appears to have not happened in the classroom at all. And I'm going to ask you this question perhaps in maybe 2 or 3 other contexts as we continue our conversation. But as we begin to move to your period at Oxford, but before we do, I want to ask you a question I will repeat in 3 other contexts. How did your time at Winchester, as you understand it now, make Ian McGilchrist?
Gosh, of course, it's very hard to answer that from the inside, if you see what I mean. But I suppose that I would consider it the most important formative experience of my life. I mean, without any kind of a question. Oxford was very much second to that. It really was. It was something very special, and I'm so grateful for it. And it makes me sad when people rail against this system. I know perhaps why, because they feel that unduly favours those who have money, and there's probably something in that. Although I must say that in college there was a completely cross-section of society because we were all paid for, and so it's just bright boys. But also, I think there's a misconception. A lot of middle-class families who are not, by anyone's standards, rich, really laboured to find the money to give their children this education and went without, for a couple of decades so that they could give their children that education. I think now it's become even relatively more expensive, unfortunately. And I returned to Winchester to give a lecture within the last year. And I did notice that And I was told that a lot of the students there are from the rich overseas who can afford the fees. And I'm not saying that they're not clever, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with coming from overseas. It mixes in well. But it's slightly sad that I felt that the British, the English, were not well represented there.
I find this both sobering and inspiring that is it William of Wykeham, the founder in the 14th century, 650 or so years ago, by making a provision for 70 poor boys to be educated in a deep and powerful way, had an effect on generations of boys over that 650, more than half of a millennium, but also of all the lives that they touched and the institutions that they went on to shape and lead or guide, whether it was the church or the university or political life. I mean, the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is a Wykehamist, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yeah.
But it seems to me a very wonderful example of how thinking deeply about how we can provide a kind of formation for the young has a very long arc of influence.
Yeah.
Without instrumentalizing it in any way. I mean,
No.
You're not told, well, you have to go off and become a this or a that at Winchester. Far from it. But in fact, it's precisely that, the freedom you had to follow, under the guidance of your teachers, the direction of your own intellect.
Yes.
That among the many other features of the community and the very spirited life at Winchester in the period that you were there, made it, in the way that you've described so movingly, the most important educational period of your life. And would you mind telling us, Ian, roughly what years was this that you were at Winchester?
I was there 66 to 71.
66 to 71.
Yeah.
Well, let's come to Oxford then. I know that this may be the anticlimax of Winchester, and we're going to talk about All Souls and perhaps your medical education too in the stages of this conversation. But where did you study at Oxford, and what did you study?
Well, because I had a sort of filial piety towards William of Wykeham, I wanted to carry on in the tradition and go to New College, which was his foundation at Oxford, 1384, 1382, I can't remember. Something like that. So I applied there, but I was warned that although in the past New College might have looked favourably on people coming from Winchester, now it didn't. And so it would be held against you that you came from Winchester rather than in your favour. But I thought, well, never mind, I'm jolly well going to go because I believe in it. And I did. And I had to do, I don't know if it's still true, but in those days you had to sit an entrance exam. And that had to be in some sort of a school subject, along with general papers of various kinds. And what I wanted to study, and what had always been my interest, was philosophy. I basically found myself always attracted to ideas, and some of the core ideas that have lived with me and been expressed in all my work to date were things that I already had an inkling of in my teens. And they were unpopular ideas, such as that the whole is just not the sum of the parts. And my clever colleague said, so what's this something mysterious extra that has to get added in then? And I didn't know how to explain to them now, although I know the philosophers who would defend the position now. I didn't know then how to defend myself against their critique. But also other things like that on the whole, progress is not linear, but in spirals, in circles that come back, but at a higher level, and so on. That the world around us is not inert, mute, and unresponsive, but is actually in some kind of relation with us, that we help to further something in it, and it helps to further something in us. So we have our influence on the world around us, and the world around us influences us, but not just in some mechanical way. That there is something about experience that is speaking to you all the time. Unless your education has driven out of you the awareness of this deep sensation that I think all of us recognize at some level, and said, oh no, that's some sort of romanticism. It's so terrible, that word. It's used to scotch all kinds of inklings of things that are deeply important. Incidentally, I think that reviving something of the more interesting ideas of Romanticism would be an important step forward in our thinking about our relationship to one another and to the world. As it happens, the Romantic period also coincided with what I think the most sophisticated period of modern philosophy in Europe. So it coincided with people like Schelling and Hegel and so on. Anyway, I must go off down a side thing now. But these ideas came to me at Winchester, and I felt I wanted to pursue them. But I also wanted to pursue them in the context of theology, in that I didn't want to become a theologian exactly. I wanted more to indulge in the kind of philosophy that had room in it for talking about the sacred, not the kind of philosophy that had no place for it. And at Oxford in those days, philosophy was very much, and still is, I think, to a large extent, very much in what I consider a rather arid, sterile Anglo-American analytic tradition. I have nothing against analysis, but it's got to return somehow to a perception of the whole. And there just wasn't an option except one, philosophy and theology. So I thought I'll do that. And probably it's a good preparation for going into a monastery, which is what I thought I would want to do.
Is that so?
Yes. I think largely because I've been brought up from coming from a completely, modern materialistic suburban family, I'd got into a world which spoke to me, these walls of these ancient buildings, the liturgy, the music, the poetry, the things that I was learning, all enriched this. And I thought, this is how I should dedicate my time. While I was at Oxford, I changed my mind for all sorts of worldly reasons. But and I thought I didn't have probably the makings of a mind. I don't know if that's right. I mean, I think once one embarks on that and dedicates oneself to it, it calls forth what is required. But in any case, that wasn't to be my path. So I'm taking a very long time to answer a simple question about how I got to Oxford. You had to sit the exam in some school subject, and philosophy and theology were not school subjects. So instead, I sat it in English because I happened to enjoy my English classes. And so I did. And I went up I was called for a viva, an interview at New College. And my tutors, because I'd done it in English, were the examiners who examined me at that time were John Bailey, who was a great English critic. His claim to fame is probably being the husband of Iris Murdoch, but he was a great writer and a great thinker and an influence on me. And Christopher Tolkien, son of J.R.R., who was the Anglo-Saxon tutor there. And Anglo-Saxon was in those days part of maybe it still is, I don't know, part of an English degree. And they said, so what do you want to study? And I said, well, I want to do philosophy and theology. And they said, you can't do philosophy and theology. It's not even an honours degree. You're good. You need to do an honours degree. And I think it was only not an honours degree because it had only just been confected as a course and they hadn't got round to attributing honours to it. And so I was interviewed by Tony Quinton for philosophy, which was wonderful, and by a man called Gary Bennett for theology. And they said, yes, come and do philosophy, but come and do PPE or do theology. And I didn't want to do theology because I felt that closed down too many avenues. I mean, not just for my future, but I was interested in philosophy more broadly than just theology. And I didn't want to do philosophy in the regular way because it was coupled with politics and economics. And frankly, all my life I have been bored by both politics and economics and tried to keep away from them. So the English tutors said, come and do English. And so I did. They gave me a scholarship. I came, I studied it, and I absolutely loved it. I even enjoyed the Anglo-Saxon, but I particularly enjoyed the work I did with some very good English tutors, working my way through the history of English from medieval times up to the Second World War, at which time the curriculum sort of ended. And there were many things that I really enjoyed. One was John Bailey also had a wonderful sly sense of humour. He had a stammer, which he used to good effect. and which enabled him to deliver punchlines in a particularly effective way. and his good humor, his humaneness, and his insight into the richness of English literature was a joy to me. And I also had a tutor who was a great Elizabethan scholar who I very much learnt from. And also I should mention somebody called Rachel Trickett, who was principal of St. Hugh's and was an Augustan scholar. And I decided you had to do various special subjects in your English degree. And I did one called Johnson and His Circle. And there's another thing in which you had to do a pair of poets. They were specified what those poets were, like Milton and Spenser. And one was Wordsworth and Coleridge. And I thought Coleridge was fascinating because I'd been reading his notebooks. And I wanted to do that. But I thought Wordsworth, this stuffy old boy, he's a sort of pedantic sort of orator. I didn't want to do this. But I guess let's do it because at least Coleridge would be good. And I may learn in the process why people admire Wordsworth so much. Anyway, in my Johnson and His Circle, I was asked to go to tutorials with Rachel Trickett. And she and I hit it off like a house on fire. And I remember going to her principal's lodging because she had a dog called Candy, who was a regular street mongrel, who was a beautiful dog who was on all the tutorials. And for this particular thing, we were talking about Goldsmith, because he was part of Johnson's Circle. And she got onto the caesura in Goldsmith, as you do. And in order to demonstrate what happened to this verse over decades that were to come, she said, let me just read to you the movement of Tintern Abbey, one of Wordsworth's most famous poems, just the first 110 lines. Now, we were supposed to have an hour together. We'd already had nearly 2 hours together because the conversation had gone well. And I was going to be late for dinner. And I almost said to her, Rachel, don't read that to me. I learnt it at school by heart. I've read it many times since. I do know. Fortunately, I felt I couldn't say that. And so she started to read it. And I thought, I have never heard this poem before. That was a life-changing moment. And I listened to the end of it and I thought, oh my God, this sort of really entered into my soul. I thought, I can't put my finger on what there is here, but there's something very remarkable. And she began to talk about it and pointed to his use of comparatives, his use of negatives, to evoke something beyond, to evoke what we cannot actually sort of pin down. And the movement of the verse, how it moved through certain phases, how it accelerated and then slowed down, very much sort of rallentando, and you felt, as the words themselves implied, that you were going into a sort of deeper, almost trance-like, sleep-like state. It was astonishing. I mean, people say they've had drug trips and so on. I don't need drug trips. I had Rachel Trickett reading the Tintern Abbey Ode. And I remember leaving and walking down the Woodstock Road back to my college. I think I was late for dinner, but it didn't matter. And my feet scarcely touched the ground, and I sort of, everything was transfigured, you know, there was a sort of gleam to everything. It really was one of those moments. So that was all part of how it was in Oxford in those days. And there were sort of looming shadows of things to come. There was a tedious Marxist movement in which everything was ground through the mill of Marxism. And you had foregone conclusions about things that were good and things that were bad because, you know, they didn't fit with the triumph of the proletariat and so on. It seemed to me a terrific way of avoiding confronting good writing and trampling roughshod on great literature. And then there started to be deconstructionism and the very beginnings of feminism, which, to begin with, I was extremely receptive to. I thought, gosh, this is a marvelous movement. I'm completely on side with what it sees as missing and wishes to do. Over my lifetime, lots of movements have gone from making a needed correction to becoming tyrannical, to becoming themselves dogmatic, rigid, and destructive of what it is they're examining. But anyway, what I'm really trying to say is that there was a blessed lull for me. There were noises off of these other things, but generally it was possible still, to go and meet on your own terms this work of literature, not judge it, but allow it to speak to you. So that was fantastic. And then John Bailey said to me, there's something called the All Souls exam. I'd never heard of it. All Souls was a college right in the middle of Oxford, in fact, next door to New College. And it was rumoured to be very odd. There were no students there at all. No undergraduates, no postgraduates, no students. And it had imposing gates that opened onto Radcliffe Square, the centre of Oxford. It looked very beautiful. It's a Hawksmoor quadrangle that you see through those gates. But you had very much the sense of peering in through a grill at some amazing sort of glass bead game-like sort of enclave. And he said, you should sit this exam. And when he explained to me what it was, I said, no, I mean, that's not for me. He said, I think it is. I think you should do it. So the long and short of that is that it took place, the academic year, my third year, ended in July. And in November, there was an exam, which happens once a year, called, again, election, like at Winchester. And I found somebody, now sadly dead, but very good friend of mine, a Turkish philosopher who went on to be a professor in Istanbul, and his wife allowed me to stay with them. And I actually, no, they allowed me to stay with them. When I went for my viva, I was called back after my exams for a viva, and only people who are on the edge of failing or could redeem themselves are given a viva, except for a group of people who are considered not to be interrogated, but simply to be congratulated. And I believed, of course, because I always believe I'm an imposter, that I was on my mettle, that I was going to be failed. And when I went in, they just stood and applauded. Which, I mean, it sounds corny and awful, and I but it is actually rather lovely. So I had it my congratulated first.
These were your exams at the end of your time at Oxford?
At the end of my time at Oxford.
And just before we move to the exam that you took, the election exam for All Souls that November, what do you remember about those exams at Oxford? Because it seems to me that, and our listeners may not be aware, that it's still the case to a large degree, but perhaps even more so when you were at Oxford. There too, your trajectory of education is quite independent. You have exams you must sit at the end,
yes,
and papers you sit, and lectures
yes,
that you sit in on.
Yes.
But to North Americans, it's unrecognizable to the North American system where attendance is taken and you must be there, and it's not imaginable that you could get to the end of a university degree, let alone do well and pass the final exams without having gone to any classes or gone to this one or that one. That's just not how it is. But what?
Well, you're going to love what I'm going to tell you, which is that the first thing that I remember John Bailey saying to me is, well, Ian, they do lectures and all that sort of thing. But if I were you, I wouldn't bother going to any. And basically, we didn't. But, I mean, I'd already ingested the discipline of, and it wasn't much of a discipline because I loved reading. I loved it. I wasn't thinking, oh God, what am I going to find to say about this? And I particularly wasn't having to conform to some kind of ideology in what I said. I just was able to respond to things. God bless them, This was how it was. This is how it could be again, I pray and hope. And so the tutorials were all important. So you had an hour with your tutor on your own. You would present an essay, he would criticize, and so on. Or she would criticize, whatever. And I don't remember a lot about the exams. They're rather an occasion. There is a special building called the Examination Schools, which is only used for examinations. And it looks like a college in itself. And you, certainly in those days, you had to dress in what was called subfusk, which meant a dark suit, a white shirt, a white tie, and your gown. And this, of course, may sound terribly stuffy, but it actually has a lot of psychological sense in it. It really puts you on your best. You're dressed up for it, you look smart, you go in there, you give your best. And it psychologically is quite an important thing. And afterwards, people would, particularly at the end of finals, there's a tradition that your friends would welcome you with a bottle of champagne. And sometimes quite a lot of it got spilt on people. But I don't really remember a lot about the actual exam, except that, it asked me questions that I didn't mind answering.
Do you know why the examining body, regarded your results as extraordinary, as worth congratulating?
They just said, I don't remember, honestly, and it would be embarrassing to relate, but they just said, we just want to say, very well done, this is good work and you'll go places. There were 2 prizes in English at Oxford, which I've gone in for and got as well. And at least in one case, the examiner wrote to me afterwards and said, this was the English essay prize. I've got the essay. So they were very, do you know what I mean? They were very personal and very encouraging. And they didn't mind telling you if you were wasting their time. It was quite different from sort of pussyfooting around and protecting feelings. They would say, well, look, actually, it didn't happen to me, but I know one of my colleagues wrote an essay, and after he'd finished reading it, the tutor said, can you give that to me? And he just tore it up like that and said, see you next week. I remember trying to read an essay about Virginia Woolf to John Bailey, and he got up and he started fussing around with a pile of papers. And it was particularly off-putting because I think, is he really listening? And of course he wasn't. And he was making the point, I think you can stop now. And so I did. And then, of course, we had a much more interesting discussion. So it was fun in those days.
Now, we were speaking about your exams at Oxford. On the way, which you took to conclude and to be admitted to your undergraduate degree, you were became a bachelor at Oxford, and then that November, a few months later, you sat the election exams at All Souls.
Yes.
Tell us about those.
Okay. Well, in those days, sadly, it has changed, and I think this is a shame, but I'll tell you how it was and what's happened. It was 3 days of exams in the college hall. I think there's a maximum number, but at any rate, there was about 24 of us. And you knew that they would either elect 2 or 1 or none. So it wasn't a question as we always have to have 2 every year. It was like, in an excellent year, we will have 2. But if nobody's good, we don't need to elect anybody. So they had an idea in their mind of what they were looking for. And so it was rather nerve-wracking. And there were 6 half days, so 3 days, and an interview. And in the 6 half days, 2 of them were on your special subject, which in my case was English. 2 of them were general papers, which everybody had to do whatever. And these would be very general philosophical questions. Philosophical in the broadest sense. They might be economics, might be, a whole lot of things. And in the year I did it, I remember one of the questions was a quotation from Lichtenberg, the 18th century German philosopher. "O God, that windest up our sundials." Discuss. Anyway, so that was the 2 days, your own speciality, the general papers. And then the 3rd day was the really fun thing and the famous thing, which was that in the morning you had to write an essay, and the essay was on 1 word, and the word was on a sheet of paper that was face down beside you, and at the word, you turned it over and saw what the topic was. And you had to write about it for 3 hours. And I turned mine over and it said evil. And I thought, oh gosh, I wonder how I tackle this. And everybody was kind of obviously thinking to begin with. But after about 10 minutes, I was looking around the room, most of everybody was beginning to jot things down. And certainly after half an hour, everybody was in flow, and I wasn't. And I was scratching my head, and another half hour went by, and I thought, crikey, I've just wasted a third of the time I've got to write this essay. You must start now. So I did. And for some reason, it was a success. Derek Parfit, who became a friend and a colleague, who's a fairly well-known philosopher, very kindly photocopied my essay and kept a copy for me to give to me after I was elected, because he said, I think you'll want to keep this. So that was good. And then the afternoon was just pieces of text in, as I remember it, Greek, Latin, French, German, Russian, and Spanish, and you simply had to translate as many of them as you could in 3 hours. Since my time, they've got rid of the essay question, which I think is a huge shame. It's like everything has become much more narrow, siloed towards people who are going to be specialists in something. But the whole ethos had been, until very recently, that you chose people who could turn their mind to almost anything, frankly. And that had always been the idea of the rounded education that places like Winchester and Oxford gave. And that meant that if you had a good degree from Oxford, be it in classics or whatever, government, Morgan Grenfell, whoever, would take you. What use is a degree in classics? It's a sign that you can do some hard work, that you understand something, and probably this person will have a rounded education and be able to bring thinking that's both broad and at a high level to whatever it is that they are asked to do. So that's how it was. But anyway, there we go. And then there's a rather terrifying experience in which you either are or not called for interview. And only a small number of people were called for interview, I don't know, 4 or 6 or something. And I remember the Warden Sparrow, who's a very conservative figure, a classicist, a very clever man, but a man who in many ways squandered his exceptional talents. He invited me, as was the way it was done, for a drink before dinner. And he looked at me and he said, your hair will count for you with some of my colleagues. Because it was the time of, long-haired students. I didn't have very long hair, but I had, longer hair than people generally wear it now. Anyway, it all went very well, and I took up there. And what I particularly remember is the kindness of Derek Parfit to me. I mean, I've written about Derek briefly at times, because he was an exceptionally clever man, quite clearly. But he was also, obviously, and I think he knew it and accepted it, autistic. And the fact that autism is so congruent with some kinds of strains of philosophy is, I think, something worth thinking about. But in any case, that being the case or not, he was a very kind man, and he meant very well. And he said to me, now, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I've, got a doctorate lined up on late 18th and early 19th century literature. And he said, don't do it. He said, and he never did a doctorate. And indeed, John Bailey said, don't do a doctorate. But in fact, if you want to get a fellowship here, you're going to probably have to get a doctorate, because already this thing of having a doctorate became important. But again, this was a relatively new idea. In the past, they didn't really particularly respect somebody who got a doctorate, because they'd just beavered away at some tiny thing, whereas what they really valued was somebody who was bright all around. So anyway, he said, don't do it, and I didn't. But what was absolutely wonderful is I had a gift of 7 years in which nobody was breathing down my neck to publish anything.
This is your All Souls Fellowship.
All Souls Fellowship.
When you won the fellowship after taking that exam that you just told us about.
I was admitted as a fellow, and I had 7 years. And I had residence in college, which obviously was on the house. I had my meals paid for. And I had wonderful company. People in those days used to generally dine in when they could in college rather than be in their homes. which was possibly tough on their wives, because it was all men initially in those days. But it meant that there was a lively intellectual milieu, from which, again, I learned a very great deal. But there was also a slightly annoying degree of sort of intellectual jousting, which I didn't really remember from Winchester. Although Winchester had this sort of sky's the limit thing, we didn't really show off to one another. But I won't mention any names, of course, but I had the impression that certain people there, not in fact the most interesting people, were point scorers. And I'd started to learn Russian. I think I'd got to lesson 10, And I remember over breakfast, one of the fellows saying, "You're learning Russian, McGilchrist. Yes. What do you know about the dialects of Russian preserved in Japan and brought there by Dutch traders in the 17th century?" I said, "Search me nothing at all." But that was slightly the way in which the tedious side of things.
Yes.
But there were also the greatest and best of the people there were remarkably humble. But there were great physicists, great historians who were very genial, good company. And so I loved All Souls as well. It was a step up again after being an undergraduate at Oxford.
And how did you, 7 years, it's a nearly unimaginable thing today, and even then it was, no doubt, All Souls was in those days, and has been through its history, unlike most other colleges and universities, not only for not having students, but for its providing persons of certain talent a space to realize that in a free way. And I'd like to ask you, how did you spend your days at Winchester? What were the things you were reading and thinking about? I know it was a 7-year period, but broadly speaking, for our listeners, yes. What did you do in that period?
You mean at All Souls?
Oh, yeah. I meant
yes,
All Souls.
Yes,
Excuse
yes.
me. Yes, yeah.
Well, candidly, I'm sure I did waste quite a lot of time. I had quite a lot of fun, and with the pressure off, it was a very good time for me. But I also used it to explore certain things. I went to philosophy seminars because I became convinced that I needed to know more about the so-called mind-body problem, which had come up indirectly from my English studies. Putting it very briefly and bluntly, I thought that a work of art, namely a poem, but it's true of any of them, is an object that is implicit and necessarily implicit, that like a joke, if it's made explicit, it suddenly shatters. It's implicit, it's embodied, so it's not just something that speaks only to the analytic intellect, but is actually working on you physically. In fact, when you read a poem, though you're not aware of it, it is changing your autonomic nervous system, your blood pressure, your pulse rate, your breathing are changed by speaking it, but even by listening to it. And by reading to it, things like, tears may come to your eyes and the hair on your neck may stand up, but also your skeletal musculature is tensing and relaxing in the movement of the verse without that being something you're conscious of. So it is a very physical process, like music. And so to have excluded that was a mistake. And the third mistake was that by analyzing the poem and breaking it up, taking things out of context, one of the contexts being the body, and another being our emotional life, and another being our spiritual life. By taking it out of those contexts, it suddenly became terribly general. So, you get this wonderful crop of poems that were written by Hardy after the death of his wife, 1912, 1913 sort of poems. And if you ask me what they're about, I have to say, well, they're about the pain of experiencing the loss of somebody you love. But that tells you nothing, precisely nothing about what these poems are like, because that's the kind of thing you could hear down the pub any day. So that made me think, this is because we have disembodied and broken up something that was an embodied whole and was unique. It was entirely unique. Those Hardy is very idiosyncratic. If Hardy had never written, nobody could have imagined his style. I mean, the ultimate example of this is Gerard Manley Hopkins, I suppose. But it's true of any great writer that they have an imprint which is theirs. And that made me think about the relationship between mind and body. And the philosophers, I went to their seminars, but they were all too damn disembodied about it. And at about this time, Oliver Sacks had written Awakenings, which is his greatest work. I mean, he went on to write a lot of other interesting things, but basically nothing quite competes with Awakenings. And in reading Awakenings, I saw several things. I saw that he dealt with individual cases. That was the first thing. And through those individual cases, he saw general truths. So he didn't ignore the individual, he didn't sideline the individual or the uniqueness of them. They come to life on the page, but in them he also saw embedded truths that came to life through this individual lens. And a lot of his writing is philosophical, it was in the footnotes that accompanied the text. So there were long excursuses. And I thought, this is bloody marvelous. This is what I want to do. To encounter what happens to people when something goes wrong with their body or their brain and affects their mind and their whole way of being. Or alternatively, something happens to them psychologically and it gives rise to physical illness. This is fascinating. And so I thought, well, there's nothing for it, but what I have to do is study medicine. But I didn't really answer your question. So I spent the time, I learned Russian very badly. I read widely in philosophy and in European literature. I followed my nose where it led me, and it's usually led me to good places because I have embedded in me deep interests that have been lifelong, and that when they sense something that is responding, they go, yes, we'll go there. So it was guided by my intuitive sense of what it was I was looking for. And when I left and went into medicine, and really until 30 years ago, on reflection, I thought, God, you were given these 7 years that most people would give their right arm for, when you didn't have to publish a single paper. Parfit himself spent 7 years there and never published anything. His first publication came later, but it was remarkable. And I thought, God, you've totally wasted this unbelievable gift. But now I look back on it as, that's the problem, is that we think in this instrumentalist way. You can't know doing what I did at that time in a rather, allowing a field to be fallow for a while, but sowing things and seeing how they come up. That was a very important stepping stone to being able to do what I think I've been able latterly to do in the last 20 years, which is to synthesize thinking from a whole range of things, from different literatures, a bit from the history of civilization, the history of ideas, neuroscience, which of course I spent years and years and years studying. And I think that was the value of it in a way. And you couldn't have said what it was at the time. You see, the thing is this, if somebody said, no, every 3 months or even every year, you must show us what you've done and published, it would absolutely have stopped this process happening, because I'd have to crystallize my thinking at much too early a phase. There are many things we do in life. Some of them are involved in something as homely and everyday as cooking, where you mustn't sort of, as it were, allow the process to solidify too soon. You want certain things to happen. And in a way, what was happening is that something was stewing in there, in the sense of creating a marinade. And if I'd been asked to say what my thinking led to and to crystallize it, the conscious mind would have taken over immediately and said, oh, well, it's this idea and let's pursue that. And then, of course, it would be very hard to row back from that to where I'd been before I was interrupted and asked to make it narrow. See what I'm saying? Mm. So I've learned that I didn't waste anything. I'm very happy to look back on my life and say, I didn't waste the time, even when I was doing things that seemed like it, maybe. That's what I tell myself anyway.
Well, this I find very interesting, Ian, because the sense I have very broadly, at least here in the United States, at least amidst a certain kind of, broadly speaking, middle class, or amongst those in the knowledge economy, let's say, there's a great pressure. And I'm not saying, of course, people need to be thinking at some level about, as most people do, certainly as I myself do, about how one will make a living and so on and so forth, and hold body and soul together. And I don't mean in any way to be dismissive of these fundamental human realities. But it does seem to me that there's an immense pressure on the young to instrumentalize their own lives.
Absolutely.
And to say, well, what are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
And forcing them to answer questions that, frankly, they don't know the answers to. They can't know the answers to.
How can they?
And thereby to choose trajectories based on things they think they understand but don't really understand, and thereby to sacrifice higher order goods that they could have realized if only they had been given the time and the support to follow what was implicit. And you said something very beautiful in your following your own nose as a kind of metaphor of your intellectual trajectory. And I'm wondering, just to pause for a moment, to ask, what advice would you give young people as they are trying to figure out the direction they should travel to realize the potential that each of them uniquely has?
Well, I'm aware in that attempting to answer that, I'm in a rather privileged position, a term I've loathed recently as it's been abused. I mean, like, were my grandparents privileged? They bloody were not. Did I work for what I've got? Did I? Heck, I stayed up nights. I worked days in, days out. So it's not about not working.
Of course.
I think hard work, holding yourself to very high standards is very important. And sometimes when I say that we need to sort of loosen up the curriculum and make it more imaginative, people mean I want it to be sort of more ooshy-scooshy, woo-woo and soft. I don't. I want it to be rigorous, but I want it to take into account imagination. Now, if people are lucky enough to find an institution, and that is the problem now, but Ralston is one of the, I hope, beacons for the future of, exactly what I'm talking about, the space in which to pursue a rounded understanding of the world and an education in the best ways of thinking about it, which, after all, it would be wrong to jettison when we've got thousands of years of the wisdom that was hard-earned by our ancestors. They literally shed blood and slaved away to get to this. To give it away is a shame. I often say a tradition is a flow. It's like a river. It's absolutely not fossilized. It's always changing. Just look back at the last 600 years. Every 50 years, you can see that there is a new thing happening in the culture. So it's always been changing, long before there was this idea that progress was necessarily good. That's something that nobody has ever believed in the history of the world until the 18th century in Europe and America. So if they've got the opportunity, I would ask them not to close down opportunities too early, to not feel that they won't get anywhere unless they, A, go to university at all. Some of the brightest, most imaginative, and most successful people are people who decided not to go to university. It's not a matter of shame, especially now when universities are not what they used to be in terms of their standards and their pursuit of truth, which is, if you're not actually pursuing truths but pursuing already decided doctrines, then this is not a university that is open to the training of young minds to think for themselves, which I believe is what we should be doing. So this may sound like luxury. I mean, it was rather like when I was at medical school and I was 10 years older than the other students, but one of the consultants was saying to us, you should all be reading English literature and reading the great novels of the past if you're going to be doctors. And I thought, he's right. But this sounds ridiculous to our ears because we hardly have time to do anything. We're so run ragged by the schedule of, there really was the opposite of Oxford, lecture from morning till night, writing up notes, writing pieces, and being on the wards. And so, you hardly had time to sleep and change your underwear. It really was. So we're going to sit there and read Jane Austen? No, I don't think so. But the point is that to have good doctors, you do need people who have at least got that in their soul. And so I believe that to be a good doctor, don't jump into this, but pursue something that has a philosophical bent first. Then you'll ask and answer correctly the questions about what a human being is, what a body of a person is, what is a person indeed, what is death, Is it the switching off of a machine? Or is it the completion of something that we don't know what it is part of and how it may persist? So these are the questions that are not asked and not properly answered. A lot of my colleagues, for example, think it's obvious that organisms are machines. However, if they kept up with progress in biology, never mind the last 100 years of physics, they would know that that can't be right. There is nothing mechanical in the universe at all. So, especially not people. So, which is not to say that mechanistic thinking can't help you answer certain local questions. I believe it can. It has a place. But because it can, in a very complex system, narrow you down to answering a certain point, doesn't mean to say that it is actually a good metaphor for the whole. It isn't. I don't know what I would say. I would want them to labour to change the educational system, because unless it's changed, it's hard for them individually to avail themselves of the advice I would give them, which is to try to broaden their horizons as much as possible, to abjure every kind of dogmatic and doctrinal view of things. And frankly, I'm going to say this, I believe that the ism studies, which Roger Scruton called fake studies, are not an education. They're really a way of putting you through the schooling in received ideas from a certain clique about how you should interpret everything. And this closes your mind. But I think the point of education is to open the mind.
Well, Ian, I know we've not come to the end of your educational trajectory. We've not even gotten to medical school yet, and of all of the things that led to.
My apologies.
No, and this is not a criticism in the least, but rather to say that if you're open to it, I think we should leave our listeners here with a bit of a cliffhanger, and perhaps we can continue this conversation on another day during your visit.
Absolutely.
But we can leave it there for now, having moved from prior to Winchester schooling, you're 5 to 6 years at Winchester, you're 3 years at Oxford, and then you're 7 years at All Souls, at which point Ian McGilchrist is not yet Dr McGilchrist. He's not yet gone to medical school.
And the lowliest of the low, the first-year medical student on the ward.
That's right. Let me thank you, Ian, so very much for sharing with me and with our listeners this beautiful reflection on, and personal reflection on the formative experiences, especially educational experiences, so many of which don't look like things that we think education has to look like in our own time.
But we must get them back.
We must get them back. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Ralston College podcast. Today's episode featured a conversation with Dr. Iain McGilchrist, the first of a two-part interview about his educational history. Today, at Winchester College and Oxford University, the second conversation will pick up from there. In today's conversation, Dr. McGilchrist speaks of the importance of an educational environment marked by freedom, friendship, and the pursuit of excellence. Those indeed are the characteristics that we hope define Ralston College. I'd like to close today by inviting you to join us here in Savannah by applying to be part of our MA in the Humanities program. It is the intellectual adventure of a lifetime. The program begins with an immersive study of ancient Greek in Greece and continues for the remainder of the academic year here in Savannah, in a community that is defined above all by friendship and freedom of thought. We have a generous scholarship program that ensures that financial means will not be a barrier to any admitted student. For more information, you can visit our website at www.ralston.ac. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Till next time.